Hello everybody. In this video we are going to go ahead and we're actually going to modify an existing feature that we had already created. And that is the ability for our two potion vials to go ahead and bob up and down as if they are floating. Right now you can see they just move up very linearly and hit a certain point and come back down. And what we've done for that is we actually set it up on the scripts for the potion controller, a timer, and this is counting current time, a max number of units, and we call it direction, but it's the increments that it's moving at and whether it's moving upwards or downwards. And what happens is that the floating timer, as long as it is less than the max, we go ahead and we move the potion in the direction that our floating dir currently is set, whether it's positive or negative, and then we go ahead and we will increase the timer by the amount of time, if you move so for fixed delta time, the interval in seconds at which physics and other fixed frame rate updates are performed. Okay? Now, these are based upon elapsed time in between each time that we go ahead and call fixed update. So as fast as your computer runs, fixed update runs at a certain speed, and fixed delta time will tell you how much time has passed since the last time in seconds. Okay? So half a second, a third of a second, a hundredth of a second, things like that. And once we reach a certain point, we go ahead and we switch the direction that we are moving, whether it's up, down, and we restart the timer. So we go up, we hit a certain point, and we start to come down. Okay? And we use time to determine how long we should be floating upwards or downwards. Now, let's go ahead and, to get started, we're going to go back into Unity. And the first thing we're going to do is, here in Assets Scripts, we're going to right-click, and we're going to do Create C# Script. And we're going to call it Floating Movement. Okay? It's a script having to do with movement, and this has to do with floating. Whereas the other movement script we have is player. It has to do with the player's movement. Okay, so go ahead and open up floating movement. Now you can go ahead and you can get rid of everything in it. We're not going to need the start or the update method. Okay? All floating movement is going to do is allow us to apply the script to an object, and that object will float up and down. Okay? Now, right now back here in Potion Controller, we have the three variables that we needed and fixed update. Now we hard-coded all these values. Okay? Making them a variable was not necessary at the time. We just went ahead and set them all up as variables so that we could easily change them in our code, and then everything happens in the fixed update. In fact, all that fixed update does is handle everything related to floating. So let's go ahead and let's select all of this inside of Potion Controller. Now you can either do Control X if you're in Windows, Command X. That is, or sorry, Mac, it's Command X, and that is how you go ahead and cut text from a page. Or you can right-click and do Cut. Now it's on the clipboard, so we can go ahead and paste it somewhere else. Let's go ahead and clean up the Potion Controller script, save it, and go back over to Floating Movement. And with our cursor right here inside of the Floating Movement class, right there, go ahead and paste. So we moved all of this over here to its own script for floating. Now the floating timer is just what we use to keep track of how much time has passed. Okay? What we want to go ahead and do is change the floating max and the floating dir to public variables. These are the two that will go ahead and we want to be able to change them so we can change exactly how our floating mechanic appears on screen, how fast and to what length of time objects float. So let's go ahead and save floating movement. That's all we had to do. We just had to move it from Potion Controller to its own script and change those two variables to public. Everything else about this should look exactly the same for now. I'm going to come back and change one more thing. So we've gone ahead and done that. Let's go back to Unity. Let's go ahead and go to your prefabs folder down here, Assets Prefabs, and double-click on the Potion Jump. You scroll down to the bottom, go to Add Component, type in Floating, and the Floating Movement script should show up. If you select it, it'll add it now as a component to the potions, to our existing potions. The floating max variable that we had is there, the floating dir variable is there. They both have the default values we assigned, 1 and 0.01. And if we run our script, you're going to see that the potions are moving just as they previously were. However, you're going to notice something here. If I go ahead and change, say this to 5, floating max down here in floating movement, okay, and run it, it doesn't seem to make a difference. Let's go ahead and set that back to 1. Now let's go look at our code again. Okay. Now in our code, we are using time to see the timer. However, every single time fixed update runs, we're adding on a full value, our full incremental value of 0.01. Fixed update is tied, just like update is, to the number of cycles your CPU, GPU make. Okay, so that means that this is running so fast that it doesn't matter if I went ahead and extend the time. We're still hitting the max value here, okay, within so quickly that making different changes to floating max and floating dir doesn't change anything. What we need to do is base our increments upon how much a percentage of the amount of time that has passed. So let me go ahead and I'm going to click right here just before the plus sign. Okay? Actually, let's go ahead and move this back here and click just before transform.position.y. So right here's my cursor. And then I'm going to press enter and move it onto its own line. And then I'm going to go here to floating dir and do open parentheses. And I'm going to put in time dot fixed delta time times floating dir and put a closing parentheses. Now, I moved it to a new line just so it was easier for us to read it. Okay, it's still part of the same assignation and the vector 2. But what I did was modify this right here, which you see highlighted. I took the floating dir, the amount that I want to increment per update cycle, and I'm saying multiply that by fixed delta time. Now, fixed delta time will be somewhere between 0 and 1. And that's because that is going to be that my computer updated a fraction of a second. So I only need a fraction of this increment. Okay? If I update 10 times per second, then that means that this should actually be 0.1 times floating dir. So I would only go ahead and go 1/10 of my increment over the course of a second. And that's just an example of the math. Okay? So now if I go ahead and let's save this, and let's go back to Unity. Let's run it. Now you're going to see that it runs a little bit differently now. Okay? They're going to go ahead and appear as if they're just kind of bobbing just a little bit. And that's because we're now using time, not just saying this many times go ahead and move up and then this many times move down. We're actually using time to determine the fraction of it, and we're only running it for a second. That's what we set our potion's defaults to be. 1 second, and you're going to move 0.01 up and 0.01 down. Okay? And that creates such a tiny change that we're just seeing it bob a little bit. Now, some values that I found worked well is to change the floating max to 1.25 and the floating dir to 0.1. You're going to see I'm setting these on the prefab, okay, for the potions. I want all the potions to have this as their default. So you double-click potion, scroll down to the bottom, and set the values on the floating movement script to 1.25 and 0.1. And then let's go back to our game and run it. And you should see something that looks a little more... You can actually see that they're moving up and down. Okay? So it looks a little bit closer to what we're doing. Now you can go ahead and you can modify those values further. You can even go ahead, and if you wanted to, in the hierarchy, select just one of the potions, like that one. Go down, and you could modify its floating movement script values individually. Okay? So let's say if I made this to a 2.5. Notice how it makes it a bold black. That's because it's trying to tell me I have modified this individual prefab instance to be different than the base prefab. Okay? Let's go ahead and press play, and we'll watch as the potion continues to move at 0.1 up and down, but now it's moving longer. It's moving 2.5 seconds upward and then 2.5 seconds down. You notice that it's no longer in sync with the one over here. That's going to happen as they move it. They're moving for different lengths of time up and different lengths of time down. Let's go ahead and reset that back to 1.25. Okay? And actually, you'll see it's still in black because even though I set it back to what it used to be, I have gone ahead and it still sees me as having modified it. You can right-click on the value name here and do revert, and it will revert it back to whatever the prefab's defaults are. Okay? And that goes ahead and sums it up. We went ahead and we converted all of our floating functionality from being hard-coded onto the potions themselves into its own script. So now we could apply this script to any prefab in the future, and it will go ahead and allow it to bob in space. And we went ahead and looked at how we can apply time, similar to what we did in previous projects, to animations, so that you get something that's truer to the actual amount of time you want an animation to occur, not being based upon just frame rates. And we went ahead and looked at how you can go ahead and set these values here on the script and modify them to be different from the prefab if you want. Thank you very much.